Cassian Voss and Elira Hale were the perfect love story, childhood sweethearts who found their way back to each other after years apart. But beneath the warmth of their reunion, beneath the vows they exchanged, a dark secret lay buried, one that Cassian would uncover too late. Cassian Voss had always believed in fate. He and Elira Winter had met as children, running through fields in their small town, chasing fireflies in the summer and building snow forts in the winter. Their bond had been effortless, the kind that felt destined, as if the universe had drawn them together for a reason. But as they grew older, life took them in different directions. Cassian left for college, determined to build a career, while Elira moved away without a word. For years, he wondered what had become of her, until one day she returned. It happened unexpectedly. Cassian had been working on the construction site of a new building when he saw her standing in the distance, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, the same piercing blue eyes that he had never quite forgotten. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, but there was something different about her now. She carried herself with a quiet grace, a confidence that was almost unnerving. Their connection reignited instantly, as if the years apart had never happened. Elira told him she had been traveling, working in different cities, never staying in one place for too long. She spoke of adventure, of searching for meaning, but there were gaps in her stories, details that seemed deliberately vague. Cassian didn't question them. He was too consumed by his love for her, too lost in the way she made him feel like a boy again, chasing something just out of reach. Their whirlwind romance led to a quick engagement. Everyone in town spoke of how perfect they were together, how they had always been meant to find their way back to each other. The wedding was a dream. White roses, candlelit vows, and the kind of happiness that seemed untouchable. Cassian watched her walk down the aisle, her smile radiant, her eyes holding something he couldn't quite name. It was only later, when they settled into married life, that he began to notice the cracks beneath the surface. Elira was a loving wife, devoted and attentive. But there were moments when she seemed distant. Sometimes he would catch her staring out the window, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress as if lost in a memory. Other times, she would wake up in the middle of the night, breathing heavily, her skin damp with sweat. When he asked what was wrong, she would smile, kiss his forehead, and tell him it was nothing. Strange things began to happen. One evening, he came home to find her sitting in the dark, her hands trembling as she held an old locket. He had never seen it before. When he asked about it, she quickly tucked it away, brushing it off as a keepsake from her childhood. Another time. He found her cleaning out a box of old papers, her expression unreadable as she shredded documents he never got the chance to look at. Cassian told himself he was overthinking things. Everyone had secrets. The past didn't always need to be explained. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about Elira that didn't quite fit, like a puzzle with a missing piece. Then came the letters. At first, they seemed like junk mail, envelopes with no return address, tucked between bills and advertisements. But when he picked one up, he noticed the way Elira's face paled at the sight of it. Without opening it, she threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed the paper. He asked her what it was, but she only smiled, as she always did, and said it was nothing. Cassian loved his wife. He had promised to trust her. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that love alone was not always enough to keep the truth buried. Cassian had always been a rational man. He believed in facts, in what could be explained, in what made sense. But the stranger who approached him that evening shattered the careful order of his world. The man appeared out of nowhere, his face gaunt, his eyes darting nervously as if he feared being watched. His clothes were worn, his hands trembling as he spoke. He didn't introduce himself, didn't explain why he had come. He only muttered a warning, one that sent a chill down Cassian's spine. It was about Elira. The man claimed she wasn't who she pretended to be. He spoke of a past filled with shadows, of people who had disappeared, of questions that had never been answered. Before Cassian could react, the man had turned and walked away, vanishing into the night as suddenly as he had appeared. Cassian stood frozen, the stranger's words echoing in his mind. For hours, he tried to convince himself that it had been nothing, some mistake, some cruel trick played by a man with too much imagination. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't let it go. The way Elira had acted in recent weeks, the letters she burned, the distant look in her eyes, it all came rushing back. He told himself that love required trust, that his wife deserved the benefit of the doubt, and yet doubt had already taken root. The next morning, while Elira was out, Cassian searched their home for anything that might explain the stranger's warning. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that something inside him told him the answers were there, waiting to be found. He combed through drawers, flipped through old photo albums, searched for anything that felt out of place. It wasn't until he reached the closet in their bedroom that he found it. Tucked beneath a pile of winter coats was a small wooden box. It was locked, but the latch was old, fragile enough that with a little force, it snapped open. Inside there were photographs, yellowed with age, but it was the image on top that made his heart stop. It was a picture of Elira, younger but unmistakable, standing beside a man Cassian had never seen before. They were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, the kind of pose that spoke of love, of promises made. But the name scrawled on the back of the photograph made his stomach churn. Dorian Cade. Cassian had never heard the name before, but something about it sent a shiver down his spine. He flipped through the other photographs, all of them showing Elira and Dorian together. In one, they were standing in front of a house. In another, sitting on a beach, their fingers entwined. But it was the last picture that unsettled him the most. It was different from the others, taken at night. The background shrouded in darkness. Dorian stood alone in this one, his expression serious, almost tense. But what disturbed Cassian wasn't the man's face. It was the way the photograph ended abruptly, cut off at the edge, as if someone else had been standing beside him, only to be deliberately removed. Cassian's hands trembled as he placed the photos back in the box. He had married Elira, believing he knew everything about her. But there had been no mention of Dorian, no hint that she had once belonged to someone else. It wasn't just that she had kept it from him. It was the way she had erased it completely, as if that part of her life had never existed. When Elira returned home that evening, she was the same as always, smiling, warm, her voice soft as she asked about his day. But Cassian couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing beside a stranger. The warning from the man on the street no longer felt like nonsense. It felt like the truth. Cassian couldn't ignore what he had found. The name Dorian Cade became an obsession, a puzzle he had to solve. If Elira had loved this man, why had she never spoken of him? And why had the photograph been hidden away, locked in a box, as if she had wanted to forget he ever existed? Cassian knew there was only one way to find answers. He had to find out what had happened to Dorian Cade. His first step was searching online. He typed the name into search engines, scrolling through articles, obituaries, anything that might give him a clue. At first, nothing significant appeared, just old business listings, a few mentions of community events, but then he stumbled upon something chilling. Dorian Cade had gone missing. The disappearance had happened years ago in a different town, long before Elira had returned and re-entered Cassian's life. There had been an investigation, a search effort, but no body had ever been found. One article described him as a promising young businessman, engaged to be married, with a future full of possibilities. But just days before his wedding, he had vanished without a trace. His car was found abandoned near a wooded area, his phone left behind. There had been no signs of a struggle, no evidence of where he had gone. It was as if he had simply disappeared, into thin air. Cassian's heart pounded as he read further. The case had gone cold, and with time, people moved on. But there was one detail that sent a chill through him. Dorian had been engaged to a woman named Elira. It was her. The woman in the article had the same face, the same striking eyes, the same delicate features. But the Elira described in these reports wasn't the same woman Cassian knew. According to witness statements, she had been different, secretive, withdrawn in the days leading up to Dorian's disappearance. His friends had reported that he seemed anxious, even afraid, though he never told them why. He had confided in one person, telling them that he had uncovered something about Elira that disturbed him. He had planned to confront her, to call off the wedding. But he never got the chance. Cassian sat back, the room spinning around him. The woman he had married, the woman he had loved for so long, had been at the center of a missing persons case, and she had never once mentioned it. He needed to know more. Determined, he traveled to the town where Dorian had last been seen. It was a quiet place, much like their own. A town where people remembered everything, where secrets didn't stay buried forever. Cassian walked through the streets, trying to picture Elira here, living another life, loving another man. He visited the places mentioned in the articles, spoke to locals who had been around during that time. Most people had little to say. They barely remembered the case, dismissing it as old news. But then Cassian found someone who had known Dorian well, a retired detective who had worked on the disappearance. The man was reluctant to talk at first, but when Cassian mentioned Elira's name, his expression darkened. He had always suspected her, he admitted. There had been something unsettling about the way she reacted after Dorian went missing. She had claimed she had no idea what had happened, but she left town almost immediately, cutting ties with everyone. There had been no direct evidence to link her to the disappearance, no proof of foul play, but the detective had never been convinced. There was one detail that stuck with him, something he had never been able to explain. The night before Dorian disappeared, he had told a friend that he had discovered something about Elira. Something terrible, something he wished he had never found out. But before he could say more, he was gone. Cassian's blood ran cold. Dorian had uncovered a secret, and whatever it was, it had cost him his life. Cassian returned home with a heavy weight in his chest. The drive back felt endless, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't push away. Elira had been engaged to Dorian Cade. He had disappeared just days before their wedding, and she had left town immediately after. There had never been any proof that she was involved, but the detective had never believed her innocence. And now, years later, she had married Cassian without ever telling him about her past. The house felt different when he walked inside, as if the walls were closing in on him. Elira greeted him with her usual warmth, her lips curling into a gentle smile, but Cassian couldn't look at her the same way. The woman he loved, the woman he had trusted, was hiding something terrible. He could feel it in the way she carried herself, in the way she moved through their home, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. That night, Cassian lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Elira slept beside him. He listened to her steady breathing, wondering how someone could keep a secret like this for so long. His mind kept circling back to the last words Dorian had spoken to his friend. He had discovered something about Elira, something that had terrified him. Cassian had to find out what it was. The next day, while Elira was out running errands, he searched their home again. He checked every drawer, every closet, every hidden space he could think of. The box of photographs had already given him one clue, but there had to be more. If Dorian had found something that made him disappear, then Cassian needed to know what it was before it was too late. He scoured the basement, shifting through old belongings, opening boxes that had been left untouched for years. At first, he found nothing, just old clothes, keepsakes, and forgotten trinkets. But then, in the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old furniture, he found something strange, a small, locked metal case. His pulse quickened as he picked it up, examining the lock. It was rusted, but still intact. He searched the house for something to pry it open, finally using a hammer to break the latch. The moment the case clicked, open, his breath caught in his throat. Inside were stacks of documents, letters, and old news clippings. Some of the articles were about Dorian's disappearance, but others were older, stories about other missing men from different towns. The dates spanned over a decade, each article describing a similar pattern. A man would go missing, leaving behind no trace, and their cases would go cold. Then Cassian found something even more unsettling: identification cards. Driver's licenses, all belonging to different men. Some were worn, faded with time, but each one had something in common. The men all resembled him. Same general features, similar builds, similar hair color. His hands shook as he flipped through them, realizing what it meant. These weren't just random people. These were men Elira had been with before, and every single one of them had vanished. Chill ran down his spine as he looked at the final item in the case. A handwritten note, the ink slightly smudged. It was a name. His name. Cassian Voss. It was the only thing written on the paper, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. He had thought he was uncovering Elira's past. But now, he realized something far worse. He wasn't the first, and if he didn't find a way out, he wouldn't be the last. Cassian's entire body tensed as he stared at the note with his name scrawled across it. His mind raced, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. He had spent days searching for answers, trying to piece together Elira's past, and now he had found something worse than he ever imagined. She had done this before, over and over again, and now his name was on her list. He stuffed the papers back into the metal case, his hands trembling as he forced it shut. His breathing was shallow, his body flooded with adrenaline. He had to think. He had to act. If Elira knew he had found this, there was no telling what she would do. Cassian hurried upstairs, forcing himself to move as calmly as possible. He checked the time. She would be home soon. If he tried to run now, she might suspect something. He had to be careful. He had to make her believe everything was normal. He forced himself to go through the motions of his usual routine, but his thoughts raced. He needed a plan. He couldn't confront her. Not yet. Not when she had already gotten away with this so many times before. He needed proof, something undeniable that would expose what she had done. The documents were enough to convince him, but he needed the police to believe it too. When Elira walked through the front door, Cassian was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He willed himself to look relaxed, to smile the way he always did. She kissed his cheek, asked about his day, her voice warm and familiar. But now, all he could hear was the truth beneath her words. She was planning something. That night, he barely slept. He lay in bed, feeling Elira's presence beside him, her breathing steady and even. The thought made his skin crawl. He couldn't stay here. He had to get out before it was too late. By morning, Cassian had a plan. He left for work as usual, but instead of going to the construction site, he drove straight to the police station. He walked inside, his hands clutching the metal case, his pulse racing. When he sat down in front of the detective, he laid everything out. The IDs, the news articles, the note with his name on it. The detective listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Cassian finished, there was a long silence before. The officer leaned forward. He told Cassian to go home, to act normal, and that they would begin an investigation immediately. They would look into Elira's past, find out if there was any solid evidence linking her to the disappearances. But Cassian knew better than to wait. He had already seen what happened to the men who waited. He wasn't going to be one of them. That night, Cassian packed a small bag, taking only what he needed. He moved quietly, carefully, knowing that Elira was only a room away. The moment had come. He had to leave, had to disappear before she realized what he had done. But as he reached for the doorknob, a voice behind him froze him in place. She was awake. Cassian turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Elira stood in the doorway, watching him with an unreadable expression, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. Not the woman he had loved, not the girl from his childhood, but the predator she truly was. She smiled, tilting her head slightly, as if amused by his fear. And in that moment, Cassian knew. She already knew everything. The trap had been set long before he ever realized it. And now, he was exactly where she wanted him to be.